You know, when a new drug gets the green light, we're all usually focused on one thing, right? Does it work? But there's this whole other side to the story that's just as critical: safety. So today, we're going to crack open the strategic playbook that makes sure medicine is as safe as it can possibly be. Let's dive in. And this question, it just cuts right to the chase. It's not enough for a drug to be effective. Regulators need to see a plan, a really solid plan, for managing any and all risks that might pop up. This is where the real strategy, the real foresight comes into play.
All right, so here's the game plan for today. First, we'll define this safety blueprint. Then, we'll look at how it's actually built. After that, we'll tackle the global challenges. And finally, we'll understand why this whole process is such a game changer in medicine.
Okay, first things first. Let's nail down the basics. What exactly is this safety blueprint we're talking about? So, a risk management plan, or RMP for short, is basically the company's promise. It's their formal, written-down commitment to regulators and really to all of us that they're going to proactively manage a drug's safety for its entire life. I love this because it perfectly captures what the RMP does. Think about it. On one side, you've got this mountain of scientific data, all the lab work, all the clinical trials. And on the other, you have the really high standards of regulatory agencies. The RMP, it's the bridge that connects them. It translates all those raw numbers into a story, a strategy that makes sense and proves the drug is safe. All right, so we get what an RMP is in theory, but how do you actually build one? How do you turn that mountain of data into a real actionable strategy?
Well, it really boils down to 3 key steps. First, you have to identify every single risk you can think of. Then, you've got to have a solid plan to monitor those risks once the drug is out in the real world. And finally, you lay out exactly what you're going to do to reduce them. So remember, identify, monitor, and reduce.
In that first step, identifying risks, it all starts with the evidence. This isn't just guesswork, right? It's built on a solid foundation of hard data that's been gathered from, well, everywhere. From the earliest toxicology studies in the lab, all the way through massive human trials. And they even look at data from similar drugs that are already on the market.
Now, what I find really fascinating here is how they categorize this data. It's not just about the risks we know are there. It's also about looking at potential risks, the what-ifs, and maybe most importantly, it's about being honest about what we don't know yet. That missing information bucket is absolutely crucial.
Which of course leads to the big question. It's one thing to spot a risk in a super-controlled clinical trial, but what happens when millions of different people start using a drug in the messy real world? And that's where the Pharmacovigilance Plan, or PV Plan, comes into play. Now, pharmacovigilance is a bit of a mouthful, I know. It's just the fancy industry term for drug safety monitoring. The whole point of this plan is to show that the company is being proactive, that they have a continuous system for keeping an eye on things, not just waiting around to react if something goes wrong.
So how do they do that? Well, they have a whole toolbox of methods. It goes way beyond just the standard reporting of side effects. We're talking about commissioning brand new studies after a drug is approved, creating special patient registries to track people long-term, or even sending out really specific questionnaires to get more detailed info.
Okay, so you're identifying and monitoring the risks. Now, how do you actually reduce them? Well, the strategy kind of has 2 levels. You've got your routine measures. These are the basics that apply to almost every drug, like putting clear warnings on the label. But then, for the more serious stuff, you need additional measures. For example, imagine there's a super effective drug, but it carries a really high risk of causing birth defects. An additional measure there wouldn't just be a warning label. No way. It would be something like a controlled distribution system, where both the doctor and the patient have to sign off that they understand the risks before a pharmacy can even give out the medicine. See the difference? It's a whole other level of safety.
So you can see how complex this is, right? And that's just for one country. Now imagine trying to do this on a global scale. It's a massive worldwide balancing act.
What's interesting is that the terminology can be a little different depending on where you are. In the US, the FDA calls them REMS. That stands for Risk Evaluation and Mitigation Strategies. Over in the European Union, they stick with RMPs. But honestly, the name doesn't really matter. The core principle is exactly the same no matter where you are. A drug's benefits must outweigh its risks, and you've got to have a clear strategy to prove it. And yeah, that is way easier said than done. The teams putting these plans together are wrestling with some huge challenges. I mean, think about it. They're trying to predict long-term risks with only short-term data. They're coordinating these massive teams of scientists and regulators. And all of this is happening while the science and the rules are constantly changing. It's a real moving target.
So after all that incredibly hard work, you gotta ask, what's the payoff?
Why is the RMP considered such a game changer? Well, it's because it is so much more than just another piece of paper for the regulators.
For starters, a really solid RMP sends a powerful message to regulators. It tells them that the company is competent, they're transparent, and they take safety seriously. It builds this foundation of credibility and trust that can be absolutely invaluable during that whole approval process. But at the end of the day, this is what it's really all about, isn't it? Patient safety. A strong plan directly protects people by thinking ahead and minimizing potential harm. And that proactive approach, that's what builds and maintains public trust in new medicines.
And hey, there's a business angle too. A good RMP provides stability. By thinking through all the potential what-ifs ahead of time, a company can manage its product's life cycle much more predictably. It helps them avoid those big, damaging safety surprises down the road.
And honestly, this quote just nails it. RMPs aren't just about ticking a box for compliance. They are the very definition of responsible innovation. They prove that a company is balancing that incredible drive to create new cures with its profound ethical duty to keep patients safe. And all of this leaves us with a really important question for the future. In a world where innovation is happening faster than ever, with brand new types of therapies coming out, how do we keep managing all this uncertainty? The principles we've talked about today, clarity, being proactive, accountability, they're not just important, they're going to be absolutely essential.